On this episode of the Neutral Wisdom Podcast, Satanic Warlock Robert Shirley welcomes Church of Satan Magister Dr. Robert Johnson, author of the Satanic Warlock, to discuss Warlock Archetypes and becoming your true self. You are listening to the Neutral Wisdom Podcast, a podcast dedicated to passing on knowledge and experience from a satanic perspective, hosted by Satanic Warlock Robert Shirley.
Greetings and welcome to the Neutral Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Satanic Warlock Robert Shirley, and today I am honored and privileged to be able to welcome the man himself, author of the Satanic Warlock, and one of the main reasons I am sitting here today, Church of Satan Magister Dr. Robert Johnson. I've written many essays detailing our transformation into our true selves or our warlock selves. It's a journey, to be sure. But I figured the person who's best qualified to explain the true meaning of the Warlock Archetype and transformation is none other than the man who created the concept. This will be a huge benefit to anyone who's just starting out on this journey, or for those who've already made this transition. Before we welcome Magister Dr. Johnson, I'd like to read an unpublished article from my upcoming book, Neutral Wisdom, Contemplations of a Satanic Warlock. This article is entitled, My Hero. You can't be a character, you have to be yourself. When developing your Warlock archetype and self, Magister Dr. Robert Johnson recommends choosing a person who best fits your desired image and studying them. What do they wear? How do they act? How do they treat others? All of these traits can provide guidelines for you to reimagine yourself into the person you want to become. Model yourself after your example and you can't fail, right? Well, wait a minute. Let me explain what happens when you go too far or when you think you actually become that person. It isn't pretty. My role model was one of the greatest professional wrestlers who ever lived. That's right, Nicholas Warren Francis Nick Bockwinkel. If you've never heard of Bockwinkel, I am really giving away my age here. But old tricky Nick himself. He held the American Wrestling Association Heavyweight Championship of the World 3 times from 1975 to 1987. Bockwinkel was one of the best heels, or bad guys, professional wrestling has ever known. Bockwinkel was arrogant and cocky. He wore expensive suits and looked down his nose at the wrestling fans. Bockwinkel was better than you, and he wanted to make sure you knew it. Modern-day wrestling fans may recognize this attitude from current-day grappler Maxwell Jacob Friedman, or MJF, in All Elite Wrestling. Wrestler Chris Jericho also modeled himself after Bockwinkel in 2008-2009. So this is a person who a lot of people and performers have wanted to model themselves after. In addition to being a great performer in the wrestling ring, Nick Bockwinkel was also an extremely eloquent speaker. Wikipedia's article on Bockwinkel states, Bockwinkel was known for his calm, charismatic, articulate promos, which distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. I used to use the 4, 5, and 6-syllable words as best I could, Bockwinkel was quoted as saying in the book The Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, The Heels. If I ran across one I didn't know, I had a little dictionary. I would have this little dictionary with 70 or 80 words that I would always be perusing. I had it with me all the time. Automatically, some of these words just started coming to me in my interviews because I was familiar with them. Check out some of Bockwinkel's old promos on YouTube. He used words which went right over the audience's heads. Words like obdurate recalcitrance, cretinous humanoids, or entity of existence. It wasn't until later in my life that I realized that Nick Bockwinkel wasn't Nick the man, he was Nick the character. His job was to put on a show, to make fans hate him as part of the performance, and how I loathed him as a very young wrestling fan. There was no dastardly deed Nick wasn't capable of, especially when facing my favorite baby faces. Lying, cheating, foreign objects? Boo to Nick. But Nick Bockwinkel was also everything I was not while I was growing up. He was rich, respected, confident. He used big words. He dressed well. He believed in himself, and it showed in his words and actions. I wanted to be just like Nick. Hell, I wanted to be Nick. It wasn't until I started to develop my Warlock self that I realized I could be Nick. I chose the archetype of the intellectual. I'd always been smart and learned everything I could about any of my interests. I'm usually able to hold intelligent conversations with others who have similar interests. To me, that was also Nick Bockwinkel, an intellectual who was all the things I was not. And so I set out to become the me version of Nick Bockwinkel. I dressed better. I started using big words. I started looking down my nose at people. I went all in. Big mistake. I am not Nick Bockwinkel. And unlike the world of professional wrestling, my life is not scripted. People are not given guidelines on how to react to me. And if you get punched in the face, it hurts. For real. Acting like the character of Nick Bockwinkel was completely counterproductive to my lesser magic. Sure, it gave me the command to look with my updated wardrobe. But, as anyone will tell you, looks don't matter if garbage is coming out of your mouth. I didn't get the same respect as Nick did, neither did the fame or riches come pouring in. Was I guilty of the satanic sin of counterproductive pride? Hell yes, I was. Developing the warlock self is a process. You have to try different things and be aware enough to see what works and what doesn't. You must strike a balance between your role model, the warlock self you think you want to become, and your true self. These three are rarely, if ever, the same person. You're going to screw up. If you didn't make mistakes, you would already be an exemplary warlock, Satanist or not. Recover from your mistakes. Self-assess. Try again and again and again, as many times as it takes until you get comfortable with it and start to see results. Base your archetype on a role model, but look at the role model. Is it a character or is it the actual person? What traits do you share with your role model? What do you need to develop? Is there anything about the role model you don't like? For example, Pirates of the Caribbean's Captain Jack Sparrow is nothing like the real Johnny Depp. I assume. I don't know either one of them personally. And I would hazard a guess that you are not like either one of them. If you try to be Captain Jack, it probably won't work. If you try to be Johnny Depp, well, it might work, but why imitate? If you try to adopt the traits you like about Captain Jack and Johnny while remaining true to yourself, now you're on the right track. The true warlock self is a reflection of your true self and all of the traits you wish to have. It takes time and work to develop into this person. So, if we ever have the chance to meet in person and you're acting like Nick Bockwinkel or Captain Jack, I'll know. Let's pause here for a quick break, and when we come back, we welcome Magister Dr. Robert Johnson, author of the Satanic Warlock.
You are listening to the Neutral Wisdom Podcast. For comments, questions, or suggestions, email devilishgentleman71@gmail.com.
Elevate your style with the epitome of sophistication and charm. Introducing the Warlock Emporium, where fine craftsmanship meets timeless design. It's not just an accessory, it's a statement of your impeccable taste. My high-quality clothing, jewelry, business accessories, and home decor aren't just additions to your lifestyle, they're conversation starters. So please visit me at thewarlockemporium.com today, because being a gentleman never goes out of style.
Welcome back to the Neutral Wisdom Podcast. Before the break, we were discussing the Warlock Archetypes and the mistakes I made in selecting a person to model myself after. Here to tell you how not to do that and to provide some context and clarification on the Warlock Archetypes is the author of the Satanic Warlock and one of my greatest mentors, Magister Dr. Robert Johnson. Thank you so much, Magister Johnson, for being here today.
Robert, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I've always liked to support our Warlock Academy students and graduates like yourself, who have shown yourself to be quite the gentleman and quite the exemplary warlock.
Thank you, sir. And I figured, as I said at the top of the program, why not have the man himself on there, the man that kind of came up with this whole idea and really put it to paper. So I guess for anyone that's listening that's not familiar with you or your work, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself and the Satanic Warlock? And especially what I'm curious about is, what is a Satanic Warlock to you, and how do you define a Satanic Warlock?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's a big question, but I will try to be as concise as possible. The Warlock Academy is the basis for creating a new generation of warlocks, not in age, but in a new outlook and a new mindset, based on Anton LaVey's work in the Satanic Bible and the Church of Satan. So I identified early on that warlocks, that we had plenty of information about satanic witches from LaVey's book, The Satanic Witch, However, we didn't have any book for warlocks, for men within the Satanic movement. And that's basically what gave me the impetus to create this. I mean, it took years. Short, long story is I visited Anton LaVey some years ago, and we sat for a couple of days and had chats. And we were talking about masculinity and how Satanism is a patriarchal religion and philosophy. So I asked him flat out, why did you not write the Satanic Warlock as a companion to the Satanic Witch? So this was after some hours of conversation, which he said to me is, well, why don't you write it? He goes, oh, we've been talking about. He goes, now's the time. So a few years later, I pitched this idea to Magus Gilmore, head of the Church of Satan, and he, in fact, and his lovely wife, Peggy Nadramia, that they thought it was a good idea. And that's what started me on the path to research and understand what's going on in the male Satanist mind. And with the idea that Satanic men are really the last bastion of masculinity in this world, especially now, within the last decade. Masculinity has been given a bad rap. It's almost a dirty word between toxic masculinity and so on and so forth. So my charge then was to rectify that, talk about how masculinity is still very important, and especially for men in the Satanic world.
I guess there's two things I'd like to add to that, just for the benefit of our listeners. We know that you're Dr. Robert Johnson. I would love for you to tell our listeners what you're a doctor in, and just a little bit of a background as to where you come from, which kind of makes you a de facto expert on masculinity and how men should behave.
Yeah, absolutely. I hold a Doctor of Human Sexuality from the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco. That's my doctor's status. I'm also, as you probably know, I'm a journalist by trade and worked for a number of magazines, newspapers, and Playboy. So while I was at Playboy, my daily job was to determine what men wanted from all the products that Playboy had put out. And they're not just nudes and sexy movies or things like that, but what they wanted to read about, what they wanted to do to shape their lives, what kind of information would be good for them. Sort of like, a more sexy GQ magazine.
Yes.
So that was basically my job across a number of platforms. So while I was there, I was able to firsthand get an idea of where men were at for, a whole decade worth of stuff. And with that, because there are so many women involved in the Playboy empire, and some of them extremely beautiful and very desirable, who have dealt with all types of men, from the ultra super rich down to just the regular guy on the street. They would sometimes confide in me in some sessions we had, focus groups, things like that. And I learned what women want and how they react. So I combined all of this knowledge into kind of a zeitgeist in my own head, and then decided, well, I'm going to do some coaching in this world. And I went on and took a couple of mainstream coaching programs and became certified in a couple of mainstream coaching programs, and also certified as a sexologist. So all of those backgrounds together have created this being who is me, with having written the part of the Church of Satan's canon with the Satanic Warlock, and also providing counsel and the Academy for Satanic Men.
One of the great things that you talk about, I notice in your book anecdotally, that in coming to explain what men are driven by, what men want, is the observe, and observe some more. And I know you have some great anecdotes in the Satanic Warlock about people who have upset you, which is a great lesson for most of us. I'm never going to cross you, I'll tell you that.
Well, that's the power of lesser and greater magic right there.
Yes, it is. Looking at the way that, you think what drives men and what men want. How did you come to create the concept of the Warlock archetype? Is it something that you notice that the average guy, is not quite enough and needs to aspire to something higher to increase their lesser magic?
Yes, that's part of it. And that's a very good question. The Warlock archetype, I basically based it on Carl Jung, who's a famous psychoanalyst for your listeners who don't know, and was sort of a protege of Sigmund Freud, but had delved more into the matters of the mind as more ephemeral and not as solid as Freud was very black and white in a lot of his theories, which are great theories, but he was more black and white as to why we do what we do, whereas Jung actually took more of a, I don't want to say new agey, but more of a spiritual type of look at what makes the mind the mind. What is the mind? Is there a collective mind? Are we part of the universe? Is this affecting us? Is it, the human collective that we just have memories from past generations that affect us? So what fascinated me about Jung is that he pretty much codified the idea that the self is the mind and the mind is the self. So what I did, I borrowed from him because he would do things about the collective consciousness. He would talk about archetypes that represent the universal patterns and images that are part of the collective unconscious, which is basically what makes you, you. He actually had 12 different archetypes, if you're familiar at all with them. Some of them, the innocent, the everyman, the hero, outlaw, explorer, creator, ruler, magician, lover, caregiver, jester, stage. So I pretty much borrowed from that because I wanted to impart upon all of the people who read my book that the Warlock self is the core of everything. It is all humans' core beliefs, core actions is a product of their selves. So the Warlock self is the most important part of how we should act. And the Warlock archetype is the simpler way to understand yourself. Because once you put a label on it and you can visualize who you are, then that self coalesces and you say, okay, so this is who I am. And then as we grow as warlocks and men, we start to add to this, like making a clay figure. We start adding pieces from our unconscious and conscious minds, especially today, because men are so confused about who they are, how they should act, what their genders are, so on and so forth. Basically, it's not that complicated. Once we recognize through the archetype who we really are, through the Warlock self, the Warlock self is just another explanation of the Warlock's mind. Once we solidify what the Warlock mind is within ourselves, then we can better customize it for getting what we want in the world. And that, in effect, is also magical.
How would a person go about selecting their archetype? So would they use a predefined archetype like in the Satanic Warlock or by Jung, or do they do so in other ways? Do they just narrow in on something that they really believe drives them and develop that fully, or do they need some kind of a guideline to work from?
Well, first of all, the examples I gave in the book are just basic examples. I mean, no one has to adhere exactly to each one of those examples. They're just sort of giving you an outline so you could say, well, I'm like this or like that. But most of the students in the academy, as you well know, are kind of a mix sometimes of different ones, because that's what allows you to understand who you really are. The Warlock self, in effect, is more important than the Warlock archetype. The archetype is a jumping off point. So, whatever you are, the everyman, the gentleman, the black magician, whatever you are, what you identify with on a regular basis kind of morphs into something else as you go through life. One of the keys is you really need to look back to when you were a child. The games you played, the fantasies that you've lived are a good indication of your archetype. Were you a cowboy? Were you a cop? Were you a doctor? Were you a girl? Whatever. That's pretty much, that's where it begins. That's the framework for 1,000 different reasons. But if you could identify what Pat was passionate about, your archetype as a kid, as a child, pretty much leads you into what your archetype is today. And again, I said it's kind of a combination today of men, because no one is perfectly anything all the time. We just move around within that archetype.
Well, this is exactly why I wanted you here today, because the book is the guideline, but I wish I had known this before I literally jumped in with both feet. So as I described in my essay at the top, I went in hard, and it was a huge error for me. So do you have any tips for becoming that archetype? Because like I said, I adopted the intellectual, which I am for the most part, but I adopted a character, and that was a huge mistake for me. I didn't recognize that the person I was modeling myself after was actually a character, and resulted in some pretty crappy situations for me. So do you have any tips for anyone on becoming their archetype? Should they make a slow transition? Should they jump in with both feet? Any tips for the transition?
Well, you have to be constantly aware of who you are and what you're doing not even on a monthly basis or daily basis, on a minute basis. Why do you do what you do? This is what we Warlocks, I kind of pound this into them. Be aware constantly of why you are doing what you're doing, whatever it is. Why are you working a certain way? Why are you lounging around? Why are you creating something? What is it in you that is your passion? What's important for men is their passion in life, their reason for being. Masculinity is to penetrate the world, and we have to do something. We are basically warriors. Evolutionary terms, we were warriors who went out, killed animals, and protected the tribe. This is what we did. This is baked into our DNA. This is not something that we could choose. Masculinity and warlock masculinity, as far as archetypes go, when we choose one, we have to think about what is our purpose. And purpose is the operative word. When you could identify your purpose, then sort of the archetype emerges. We've also discussed at the Academy, and as you well know, the shadow self, which is a whole other issue.
Yes.
But once we actually understand who we are as men and what our purpose is in life, why we are penetrating the world, then we're better able to see what that archetype is. I often ask warlocks to name their self, name their archetype, because sometimes that makes it a little easier to understand what you're really all about.
In our other podcast, we were discussing with a guest the same kind of concept. And he said, in his opinion, it is possible to take the archetype too far and to actually eclipse the self and to be pretending more than being sincere. Do you think that that's a possibility as well?
Well, there's that word pretending is the key. I mean, you cannot delude yourself. You'll have to come to a point where you say, oh, well, I'm a rock star. I'm a black rocker. Black music, dark music, gothic rocker, and you can't play a note. Who are you kidding? We know who we are. We know by our actions. We know in our secret selves. This is where the shadow self comes in. When we identify the shadow self, we know what's really lies in there. Are we sexual perverts? Maybe. Are we so thirsty for knowledge that that's all we want? We'll disregard everything else, our families, our careers, and everything to get that? Are we adventurers? We just want to go onto the high seas and be pirates? We know deep down inside, but we mask it. And this is a problem with masculinity. We mask the feeling that make us feel like we're purposeful and penetrating the world because we want to fit in. And this is an antithesis to Satanism. We don't have to fit in. We can be unique in whatever way we want to be unique. And once we identify that we are unique, that helps with the self and the archetype. So to answer to your question, going too far is just meaning you're deluding yourself. So if you said, oh, I went too far, Well, then you got to bring it back to where you're supposed to be. You have to be conscious of it. And, and I use the word masculinity. Let me clarify this. It doesn't have to be male. Masculinity is on a floating scale. It's, as Jung said, the anima and animus, male and female, is within everyone. It's not about gender. It's about what you gravitate to in yourself. You may be very masculine or you may be very feminine, but it doesn't really matter about gender, whether you're biologically male or female. Very masculine men can be very high on the femininity scale. I mean, masculine in looks and action, but they may feel feminine and vice versa. So this is the beauty of Satanism too. We accept all people that way.
What would you say to a warlock or anyone like me who screws up probably more than a few times in making these changes? What's interesting is we really got into the academy the fear of making mistakes and how that fear becomes a self-limiting prophecy. Now, as I outlined in my essay at the top, I feel like I really made a bad mistake when I first started to do this. Can you speak to how to deal with those mistakes, with those errors, how to recover from that? Should they pick a new one and move on? Should they self-assess and try again? What would be the best kind of remediation for making errors in making any kind of a change like this?
Well, you hit on a very important phrase there, and it's self-limiting. Mm-hmm. We are often victims of self-limiting beliefs that are based on, and I don't want to get too psychoanalytical about this. We do get more into this in the academy and stuff. But the self-limiting belief starts in your childhood. It's a fear of abandonment. It's a fear of death. I mean, when you're an infant, you're in your mother or father's arms. You're completely dependent. So if they're yelling at you or you're doing something that they don't like, you are unconsciously registering this and saying, if I don't toe the line here, they're going to abandon me and I'm going to die. So we have that fear of death. And the strongest human emotion is survival. I'm just using that as an illustrative point because we have these self-limiting beliefs from infancy that we build in. Oh, if I don't do this, I'm not a good boy. If I don't toe the line, I'm bad. If I try to do this, people won't like me. If I don't look this way, I won't be accepted. If somebody said something bad about me, that makes me less than. It affects self-esteem. It affects everything. When we incur these self-limiting beliefs, when we embrace them throughout our life, in childhood and adolescence and maturity, when we embrace them, what are we doing? We're just looking for the fear. We have an attachment to outcome. The attachment to outcome means if I'm not good looking enough, so that person will not like me. Who says? It's your own self-limiting belief, right? That's your own self-limiting belief. To understand what our self-limiting beliefs are, and most importantly, understand that our mind often lies to us. Our amygdala within the brain, our emotional piece has been hurt as young children or adolescents, and that becomes reality when in our minds when our emotions kick in and take over our conscious thinking. So that self-limiting belief rises, we feel less than, and we're afraid, fear what's going to happen. We have an attachment to a negative outcome. So to fuck up is natural, but realizing why you fucked up and realizing that it was just our brain lying to us is really the cure. You may have screwed up, but you realized it, and you're not going to do it again.
Through the academy, when we learn to deal with that fear and learn that it's really in our own heads and we can deal with it, I'm at the point now in my development where it doesn't bother me to make mistakes. And in fact, in my professional career, I'm hoping that the people I'm mentoring make mistakes because that's the learning piece. And it shows them you didn't die, you just made a mistake. So let's figure out why, and let's not do that again. And that was one of the hugest takeaways from the academy for me, was not being attached to the outcome. It's what if this happens? And the answer universally is, so what?
Exactly. We cannot control most things in life. Life is chaotic, life is dangerous. We cannot control everything. So to understand that and do the possibly best and face our fears of what's going to happen and eradicate them. And then people will say, well, how do you just eradicate a fear? Well, you have to face it. You're afraid of roller coasters. What do? You get on a roller. So this is the key operative. And this is a problem today with masculinity. A lot of men, particularly younger men, even millennials and earlier, they just will think it's not necessary to face fears. But, and this is important, they still have that warrior attitude. They still have that reason of purpose in their DNA. Look at 98% of the video games that young men play today. What are they? War games, kill the aliens, drive the cars so fast they crash. What is that? That's their mind. That's their self screaming to them. You need to challenge yourself. You need to have purpose. You need to show the world that you're penetrating it. So again, the answer to your question, yeah, you may have screwed up, but if you face it and understand why you screwed up, that's the battle.
For anyone listening out there, basically what you've just received for free is a session of the Warlock Academy. So this has been great because it's literally been a revisit. It's been a one-on-one session for me, and everybody else gets to listen to it. So this is kind of where we go in the Warlock Academy. This is just tipping the iceberg. Lastly, Magister Johnson, is there anything else that you'd like to say to our listeners about business, otherwise, the Academy, any projects you're working on? This is your place to reach a different audience.
Oh, I appreciate that, Robert. A lot of what I do is men's coaching from a satanic perspective. And why is that important? Because any man who considers himself a Satanist for whatever reason, or at least aligns himself with the philosophy, can benefit from what I'm teaching, because I'm giving you the straight dope, so to speak. This is not just occultic nonsense, as Dr. LeVay would say. These are the straight answers of how life works. And I've been around long enough to pretty much know how life works. And I've been very successful at it, and I've had wonderful relationships. And so things are good at this juncture of my life. And I impart that to my students. So what I do offer, aside from the Academy, which is once or now it's growing into twice a year. So the next Academy will probably be in the fall. However, I also offer one-on-one Academy sessions, which if you sign up for the one-on-one with me, you will gain the benefit of the full Academy, but you'll get personalized attention a lot quicker. I'm also working on something that I've previewed in one of my newsletters about satanic seduction. Basically, it's a course in dating, relationships, and seduction that will include some very interesting topics. This is really about men who are having difficulty in relationships or sexuality, or how to meet mates, or anything along the relationship line. We're going to have speakers into hypnotism and all kinds of ways with no bullshit attitude towards it. This is not going to be typical red pill manosphere stuff. This is basically for men who understand the basic tenets of Satanism and want to progress in that world as satanic men and hopefully, ideally, warlocks.
What I can say from personal experience, if you are at all thinking that you would like to interact with Magister Dr. Johnson, he is going to tell you exactly what your problem is with no shame. He'll let you have it. And if he thinks you're full of it, he'll call you on your bullshit. And it's probably one of the best things that a person can hear, especially to hear it from somebody with this depth and breadth of experience. I know you've done that for me on a few occasions, and it always kind of makes you shake your head. So you had mentioned also that there's a second class of the Academy coming up this year.
Probably in the fall, I would guess the October timeframe. But again, it does not preclude someone who wants to begin early with more of a one-on-one, which is the same course, basically. It's just one-on-one, and it's more intense. So
Okay.
that's always available. And I could always be reached at information at thesatanicwarlock.com.
I got to tell you, sir, thank you. This has been an absolute pleasure. Listeners out there today have gotten a lot of amazing information provided by literally the man himself. So thank you for being here and sharing this with our listeners. And again, if you're interested in the Satanic Warlock, you can buy it wherever books are sold, all the bookstores, Amazon, or directly from Magister Dr. Johnson at his website, www.thesatanicwarlock.com. And again, if you're an aspiring satanic gentleman who would like more information on the Warlock Academy, please send an email to information@thesatanicwarlock.com. And that about wraps it up for this episode of the Neutral Wisdom Podcast. Thank you all for listening, and thank you again, Magister Dr. Robert Johnson, for sharing your wisdom. Please drop a like or comment down below. For questions or comments, you can email me directly at devilishgentleman71@gmail.com. You can listen to us on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, anywhere else you get your podcast. Check me out on Facebook under Robert Shirley and Instagram at neutral_wisdom. Until next time, ever forward.
You have been listening to the Neutral Wisdom Podcast. For more information, email us at devilishgentleman71@gmail.com or join the community on Locals at neutralwisdom.locals.com or Instagram at neutral_wisdom. Program copyright 2024, Devilish Gentleman Enterprises.